Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so it's now 10:32, so I think I'll just get started, and then anyone who comes in late, this presentation is being recorded, so you can watch it again. And I can't really see the chat, but I think Katie will monitor that. So if you have any question during the presentation, you're more than welcome to add it to the chat. Okay, so just to get started today, I'll be discussing the Residential Tenancy Act and just some of the frequently asked questions that we've noticed that students often come into our office and inquire about. So the first question is, what is the RTA? So the RTA is an act that was put in place to provide protection for residential tenants from unlawful action imposed by landlords. And it kind of provides a framework for both the landlords and the tenants on what their legal rights are and what their responsibilities are. So then from this framework, it kind of provides a way for landlords and tenants to resolve their disputes in the case that they do occur. And the second question is, who is covered by the RTA? So pretty much anyone who is renting their home in Ontario is covered by the RTA. However, I do want to make notice of some common exception. So when people come into our office, the first thing we always ask is, do you share a common space with your landlord or the immediate family members? And their immediate family members can include their children, their parents, their siblings. And the reason why is if you do share a common space with your landlord or their immediate family members, you are actually not covered by the RTA. And when you sign a lease, it's actually covered under contract law. So in the case that, for instance, your landlord does not comply with some of the stuff in your lease, you cannot go and complain to the board. And I'll be discussing the landlord-tenant board a bit later. Another exception is if you live in community housing or if you live in student residences. And I've kind of linked a quiz here. And this quiz is basically really helpful because you can literally, like, if you're looking for a place right now, or if you're living in a place, you can put in your living situation and it will basically tell you whether you're covered by the RTA or not. The third question is, my landlord asked for a security deposit. So security deposits are not allowed in Ontario and they are not legal. So if you already paid a security deposit or if your landlord asked for one, you are allowed to tell them that this is illegal and you are not obligated to give them a security deposit. Typically how rent deposits work is that when you sign a lease, typically people will give their last month's rent as a deposit. So this deposit essentially cannot be more than the amount of 1 month rent. So if your rent is $500 a month, when you sign the lease, you give them your deposit, last month rent of $500. And when you move in, you give them rent for the first month. And that's pretty much it in terms of deposit when signing leases. Rent deposits cannot be used for damages. So if you or the landlord damage the home, that's something that has to be discussed separately out of the rent. Key deposits are okay if they meet specific requirements, such as that if they're refundable or the amount is not more than the expected cost of replacing the keys. There are more specific guidelines in terms of the key deposit that are found online, but generally I found it more common that people will ask about security deposit, and landlords do ask for that. And number 4 is, where or how can I get a standard lease? So if you sign a lease that was after April 30th, 2018, you should be on a standard lease. And if you sign a lease after this period of time and you're not on a standard lease, you can make a request in writing for a standard lease. So this can be either in a text messages or in an email. We would recommend this over saying, for example, like a phone call or saying it verbally, just because now you have like a record of when you made that request and you have the date of the request. Your landlord has to give you the standard lease within the 21 days since you submit the request. And if they do not, there are more consequences. We do have a whole session on the standard lease tomorrow at 10 a.m. And Nicole will go on super in-depth about what a standard lease is and kind of what happens when your landlord doesn't follow a standard lease. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend for you to go to tomorrow's session. But for now, this is what I'll be covering. And then for number 5 is, I have repair and maintenance issues. What do I do? So your landlord is responsible for any maintenance and repair issue that come up in the home. A lot of people don't know this. The landlord is required to mow the lawn and do snow shoveling and so on. You and your landlord can make an agreement that you can do all these mowing the lawn and snow shoveling as such, but they should be providing you with the appropriate equipment. Now, in the case that you do have repair and maintenance issue, you can provide your landlord with a dated note in writing. Once again, this can either be an email or a text message, just so you can have a record of this conversation in writing. And if they do not resolve these issues, you can either request a city inspection or apply to the landlord-tenant board. So essentially, when do you go to city inspection? So for instance, if you do not have the appropriate fire exit, if something you think is unsafe in your home, for example, like open electrical wires, you can actually get a free inspection from the city. So the city of Guelph, they will assign someone to come into your home and inspect whether your home is safe or not. And if it's not, the city will kind of deal with that in further steps. And if you're a landlord, another option is apply to the landlord-tenant board. So the landlord-tenant board was formed by the RTA, and it protects both the tenants and the landlord. And if you go on the landlord-tenant board website, I can show it later after the presentation. There's a bunch of forms, and you can fill them out and apply for the board if your landlord has continuously refused to repair your whatever issues that you have. And I do want to make a note that if they are to come into your unit to repair any issue, they do have to give you 24 hours notice. And an important point I want to really emphasize is that do not withhold rent. So even if you feel like your unit is unsafe or whatever it is, do not withhold rent, because if you do have to apply to the board and they find out that you did withhold rent due to whatever issue it is, this will make the case a lot more complicated. So I would still recommend that even if you have any repair and maintenance issue, continue to pay your rent as you're supposed to. The next question is, my landlord said I cannot bring guests or have pets at all. So under the RTA, if your current lease or the lease that you're going to be signing has a no pet or no guest clause, these clauses are automatically voided because they're simply not legal. I've also noticed that landlords typically also try to implement, for example, maximum number of guests, or even what hours you can have guests in. I want to emphasize that again, these are not allowed. All of these clauses are voided. A landlord is not allowed to prohibit tenants having pets or guests in their residential units. And there are exceptions. So if you do live in a condo, so in Guelph, that would be like Solstice 1, Solstice 2, Liberty Square, they are allowed to regulate pet ownership. Number 7 is, how much can my rent increase? So typically this number changes every year, but landlord can increase rent for a maximum of 2.2% a year. And they can do this after their last rent increase or the date the tenancy begins. So in other words, they can only increase the rent once every 12 months. And I want to emphasize that this, if for instance you sign a standard lease, so typically people sign a fixed lease for 1 year. This only applies if you finish your 1-year lease and you are now going on a month-to-month basis. This means that after the 1 year, they can only increase the rent by 2.2%. However, if you choose to sign a new lease, either with your current unit or you move to a new home, it is assumed that the landlord can increase the rent amount to however much they want. This is why when students sign a fixed term lease, we typically recommend that they do go month to month, just because we think this is more advantageous to the tenants. And in the case that the landlords do want to increase rent, they do have to give a 90 days written notice. And there's also more information online here. And specifically in related to COVID and just the ongoing situation, I do want to address that there is a rent freeze until December 2021. There's more information online, but I do believe that there's small little details, such as the tenant and landlord can still agree to a rent increase for exchange of services, such as air conditioning and such, but for the most part, the rent increase will be implemented until December 2021. The next question is, can I leave my fixed term lease early? So it is important to notice that when you sign a lease, that you are signing a contract. So if you say that you will be living in this home until, let's say, April 2021, you are obligated to pay your rent for this period of time until April 2021. So when students come and express that they want to leave their lease early, the first step we always recommend is discuss with your landlord as to what your options are. Perhaps they don't care if you leave your lease. So you kind of have to like communicate first and see what your options are. Usually what landlords would do is you either have to find a sublet or assign your lease or room. And the difference between a sublet and assign is when you sublet, you're intending that you will be coming back to this home. So an example we typically see with students is, for instance, if they sign a 1-year lease, but they are not interested in living in Guelph over the summer, they'll typically sublet their unit and then they'll come back in the fall. However, if you do not intend to live in this home again, we usually recommend that you assign your lease, because when you are subletting, you are technically still responsible for the person that you're subletting for. So whatever damages they like cause to your home, you're still responsible for those. There are exceptions to the things I just mentioned above, and they're basically in the cases of if you sign a non-standard lease or if there's sexual or domestic violence concern. There a bunch of other exceptions. I just didn't have space to put them here, but we do have a booklet on leaving your tenancy early. And the 9th question is, when is my landlord allowed to enter my unit? So this all depends on the reason, but usually if it's in case of emergency, your landlord can enter without any advance notice. But for any other reasons, such as if they need to do repairs, if they need to show your place to prospective tenants or buyers, or other reasonable purposes, they do have to give you a 24 hours notice, and they can only enter between the hour of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. I want to emphasize that in terms of showing your place, this notice only applies if you have not given a notice to your landlord that you are leaving the unit. So let's say you submit a given notice, that a 60-day notice that you're moving out, your landlord can technically show prospective tenants to your place at any time. They do not have to give a 24 hours notice. And in respect to COVID, obviously if your landlord's coming over, it is important that they uphold bylaw regulations such as personal hygiene, hand washing, hand sanitizer, wearing a mask, and social distancing, and so on. And the last question is, what do I do about roommates issue? So the RTA does not cover issues typically between tenant and tenant. So we always recommend that communication is key. This is why it's important that before you even sign the lease, you discuss with the people that you're potentially signing with, kind of discuss your expectation of each other, your lifestyle choices, to see if you're suitable matches before you agree to live with one another. Individual lease is also recommended over group lease in the case you want to assign your lease. So let's say you live with a group of people and you realize that this is not for you anymore. It is easier if each of you have an individual lease than dealing with a group lease, because this typically, I've seen, it can be a lot more complicated. And our rental living resources office also has a booklet specifically on navigating roommate relationship during COVID-19. And in this booklet, we basically cover like how to make a roommate agreement, how to write a contract on what your boundaries are and what your tolerance when it comes to COVID. And this can help with the initial steps of communication. If you have any question, you can reach out to us. Our email is ocl@uoguelph.ca. I just want to emphasize that there is a session tomorrow at 10 a.m. on how to sign a lease 101. It'll be super detailed on everything you need to know about the standard lease. So I would recommend that you join tomorrow if you are interested. I can answer any question if anyone has any now.